What a 72 hours Putin has had! He's gone from displeasure to displeasure. On the one hand, the al-Assad regime has collapsed in Syria and is now history. Many years of Russian intervention down the drain. We'll talk about that at length soon. But on the other hand, the Kremlin's move in Romania, the kind of hostile takeover bid they launched against this country, ran head-on into the highest constitutional authority. Romania's constitutional court took an unprecedented decision on Friday, 6th of November to suspend the presidential elections. Why? Well, for the reason I'm about to tell you. We're talking about direct interference from Russia. According to Romanian intelligence services, the Kremlin orchestrated a huge communication campaign that led to a Moscow puppet winning in the first round. A pawn of Putin's, who, not surprisingly, was also paid for the campaign. It's the latest case of hybrid warfare and electoral interference. But what the hell happened in Romania? And how is it possible that Putin is trying to swallow this country? Pay attention to what we're about to tell you. In recent times, in certain parts of Europe, political news seems to be covered by a kind of cinematic cloak that reminds us of the most tense moments of the Cold War. And then there is Vladimir Putin, in his unusual role as General Orlov 2.0, threatening again to use nuclear weapons. There are, of course, countries that are already making rapid efforts to rebuild their military capabilities. The clearest case is undoubtedly Poland. However, surely many of you remember, just a few weeks ago here on VisualPolitik, we told you about another country that is getting in shape. In this case with the directive help of NATO. I'm of course talking about Romania. There are plans to turn this country into the air defense nerve center of Europe, which, of course, has given it a prominence it has not had for a long time. The plans call for Romania to become nothing less than the armored gate of the skies of the old continent, so that Putin, and no one in Moscow, could even dream of taking a stroll. Even so, on November 24th, something unexpected happened. Something that could put an end to all these plans. Take a look.
Shock as pro-Russia independent wins first round of Romanian election.
Indeed, another pro-Russian we have stumbled upon. Călin Georgescu is the guy chosen by Putin to try to seize power in Romania. No one expected this former UN Special Rapporteur to win the first round of the presidential elections. He ran as an independent without any political platform. All polls gave him at most 10% of voting intentions, and yet he finished first with almost 23%. It was madness. That's right, a madness sponsored in this case by the Kremlin itself. You see, Georgescu has basically developed his campaign through social media, especially the controversial platform TikTok, a platform where he's managed to become particularly viral in the country in a very short time, perhaps in too short a time. Romania's intelligence services have declassified documents showing that the Kremlin has financed Georgescu's campaign. Not only that, but everything indicates that Russian intelligence services also developed an intense campaign to promote both this candidate and messages against the West. They've done so through various means, but particularly through social media networks. For example, platforms such as TikTok were flooded with messages from this pro-Russian candidate. We're talking about a network of 25,000 TikTok accounts and Telegram groups coordinated since 2022 to amplify Georgescu's presence, payments to influencers, and the use of advanced techniques to evade detection of bots. And not only that, there were also 85,000 cyber attacks against Romania attributed to Russia, which were carried out to promote anti-Western narratives. However, most of the operations were carried out on TikTok, which has once again put this social media network in the European Union spotlight.
Romania asks EU to investigate TikTok's election handling after ultra-nationalists' stunning win.
But why would Russia do something like that? Well, let's see, call me crazy, but if a country has almost 500 kilometers of border with Ukraine, is helping the country with which I am currently at war, and is a location that NATO wants to turn into a fortress, if I were Putin, I would have it clear. Romania would be on my wish list. And precisely because of that, everything indicates that the Kremlin is indeed promoting Georgescu, a candidate who, not surprisingly, is not free of controversy. In 2022, for example, he was investigated by Romanian prosecutors for praising Ion Antonescu, Romania's prime minister during World War II, who facilitated the Holocaust in the country. Who would have thought it, right? Putin hobnobbing with a neo-Nazi whilst trying to denazify Ukraine. You know, it's another example of Moscow's legendary consistency. However, that is only the tip of the iceberg. What is really concerning about Georgescu is his admiration for Vladimir Putin and his outright rejection of NATO. Because this pro-Russian satire satellite doesn't hesitate to shower praise on the Russian dictator. In 2022, in the midst of the invasion of Ukraine, the guy even had the nerve to say that Putin was one of the few real leaders left in the world. And while saying this, he didn't hesitate in criticizing NATO. After all, he believes that if Romania were ever attacked, NATO would not lift a finger to help it. However, one thing is striking. How is it possible that a pro-Russian candidate won an election in Romania, a country where the sentiment towards Moscow is rather negative?
Romanian sympathy for Russia halved over the past 10 years, while support for Ukraine and Moldova increases.
And in the end, it has all resulted in the Constitutional Court suspending the electoral process because of this alleged interference by Moscow, which is no trivial matter. Is it acceptable to annul an election on the grounds that Romanians voted totally influenced by the Moscow campaign? Was this decision taken to prevent this candidate from winning in the second round? These are two complicated questions. The answer is complex. But first, we have to see why on earth this candidate was so scary. What real danger did he pose to Romania, to Europe, and to NATO? And also, why on earth did Romanians vote for him? Well, let's find out.
A threat to the alliance.
On the 8th of December, the second round of the Romanian presidential elections was supposed to be held. However, 48 hours prior to that, this happened.
Romania's Constitutional Court annuls first round of presidential election after revelations of Russian hybrid attack campaign.
Georgescu was to be measured in a close head-to-head with Elena Lasconi, a candidate of the centre-right, Save Romania Union Party, a more moderate party, and above all, one that is much more pro-European Union and pro-NATO than the Kremlin's scion. Many analysts claim that Lasconi would have won. However, it seems that the Constitutional Court did not want to take any risk. Of course, given what happened in other elections, who knows what would have happened? The victory of this outsider would have been considered a disaster for the country. The reason? Very simple. Russia could once again gain full control of the Black Sea. And what would this mean? And who would suffer the greatest consequences? Well, who else? Ukraine. I don't know how many of you will remember this, but in 2022, the prices of bread, sunflower oil, and pasta shot up almost everywhere in the world. Here in Europe, we clearly felt it in our pockets. And the reason for this was simple. The production and export of Ukrainian grain came to a standstill for a long time. And of course, since Ukraine is considered one of the great granaries of the world, it made perfect sense. However, after a few months, prices fortunately began to stabilize. Russia and Ukraine reached an agreement the summer the invasion started to be able to continue exporting grain to the rest of the world. It was known as the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Ukrainian merchant ships were able to sail more or less calmly again, and the prices of various grains, such as wheat, fell substantially. The world could breathe again. However, this could change again. Prices could skyrocket once more. Why? Well, precisely because of the possible arrival of Georgescu to power. And okay, I know what many of you are wondering. Why the hell does this guy winning in Romania have to do with Ukraine having problems exporting its grain again? Well, a lot more than you might think at first glance. After 1 year, it disappeared. Ukrainian merchant ships were again harassed not only by Russian warships, but also by drones and aircraft. And so it went until one day, the lifeline came from Kyiv. Romania jumped into action. No, don't get carried away. Bucharest didn't go head-to-head with Moscow, but what it did do was to make things very easy for Kyiv, so that it could continue exporting its grain across the Black Sea. And keep in mind that these exports are absolutely crucial. They are one of Ukraine's few remaining economic lifelines. And so the Romanian government took a starring role in news like this.
Ukrainian shipping company, Romania's Constanta port to increase capacity for Ukrainian grain.
Indeed, Romania ceded part of its main Black Sea merchant port, the port of Constanta, to Ukraine. In this way, Ukrainian goods could reach, in a much safer way, the Bosphorus Strait, which is controlled by Turkey and is the only exit from the Black Sea. And why do I say more safely? Well, mainly because all the smaller Ukrainian ships can reach Constanta and fill the larger cargo ships there. Then, these basically travel through Romanian territorial waters, and also, of course, Bulgarian territorial waters, another member of both the EU and NATO. And so, the role played by Romania has basically been that of a commercial lifeline for Ukraine. Thanks to the Bucharest government, Kyiv has been able to keep its economy more or less afloat, and with it, a key revenue stream for the country. But now, all this could change. And as many of you can already imagine, it is seriously feared that this pro-Russian leader, if he ultimately does become president of Romania, will veto these concessions to Ukraine. Of course, the use of the port of Constanta and the passage through its territorial waters is of no inconvenience to the country, but I think we all know what happens in these cases. When grasping at straws, a lot of nonsense can be justified, and in this case, news like this could give Georgescu the perfect pretext.
Romanian agriculture faces collapse amid mass Ukrainian grain imports.
True, such a collapse did exist for a few months, and not only in Romania, it also occurred in Poland, which eventually led to the blocking of Ukrainian grain imports. However, this news is almost 2 years old. The reality is that today, the situation is much more stable and much less harmful for European farmers, including, of course, Romanian farmers. But whatever the case, it's very likely that Georgescu manipulated this information to withdraw the concessions we have seen, and thus harm Ukraine. At the end of the day, here's what he is, just another puppet of the Kremlin. But what would happen if Ukraine didn't have access to Romanian territorial waters? Quite simply, many of its merchant ships would once again be threatened by Russia's war machines. And this, unfortunately, could once again drive up grain prices worldwide. In other words, it could hit all of our pockets again. But that's not all. Do you know what this would also mean? Exactly. Ukraine would lose one of its few remaining sources of large revenues. And now, think about this for a moment. If Ukraine runs out of American weapons, as Trump promises, and also runs out of economic capacity, under what conditions do you think it will arrive at the negotiating table proposed by the US president-elect? I can already tell you, in absolutely dire conditions. It couldn't even threaten to continue the war on its own, financing it, in part, with its maritime trade. Nevertheless, although Ukraine would bear the brunt of the Georgescu victory, it would not be the only one. The reality is that, broadly speaking, NATO would lose a major defensive asset. Pay attention to this. Georgescu has not minced words when talking about NATO. He despises it with all his being. Although, yes, after winning the first round, this outsider realized that, thanks to Moscow's support, his options were suddenly real, and that if he wanted to be president, he had to relax his tone a little bit, which is basically what he's been doing in the last few days.
Pro-Russian presidential candidate denies he wants Romania out of NATO.
Oh, Georgescu, the problem is that you've been making your position clear for years. And well, true, you might not be able to get Romania out of NATO, but you could try to reduce their presence in the country and boycott their plans in the Black Sea. And this is no exaggeration. The pro-Russian candidate has been especially acidic about a facility crucial to the defense of all of NATO, the Atlantic Alliance's ballistic missile shield in Europe. This missile shield, which is located in Deveselu, 180 kilometers south of the Romanian capital, cost $800 million in 2016, mainly coming from the United States. It's a shield that also has advanced radars and SM-3 missiles capable of shooting down Russian missiles. Well, Georgescu has been clear. This shield is a provocation to Moscow. However, let's be honest, he most likely wouldn't get rid of it either. Although, with Trump in the White House wanting to reduce base costs in Europe, who knows? Maybe they'll even strike a deal. But for the time being, there's no indication that he did so. Yet there are other crucial facilities that could fall under this mandate. Facilities that we've already told you about on this channel. The MK base.
The MK base in Romania is intended to be the largest NATO airbase in all of Europe, much larger than the Ramstein base in Germany. The idea of the current government in Bucharest is that this revamped base can accommodate 10,000 NATO troops as well as numerous fighters, both from Romania and other alliance countries. The base would thus become the jewel in NATO's aerial crown on the old continent. However, this could change with the arrival of Georgescu. With his arrival, most of the $2.6 billion intended to be invested for the base's overhaul could disappear. The pro-Russian candidate could cut off funding overnight.
And this could be a real gift for Russia. Think about it. The raison d'etre of this base is precisely to challenge Moscow's control of the Black Sea. Well, maybe not to challenge it, but to keep the Russian forces at bay. That is, to serve as a real counterweight. But of course, if the base doesn't end up being built, Putin will most likely be able to walk on the waters of the Black Sea again. And do you know what this could mean? Well, basically, that Russia could once again use this sea for its harassment and shoot-down operations. And not only that, in the event that the war in Ukraine ends, analysts warn of another additional danger. Moscow could take advantage of this to rebuild its Black Sea fleet. Don't forget that Ukraine has destroyed a third of this entire fleet in the war. And without a vigilant NATO in Romania, the task of preparation and deterrence against Russia simply becomes more complicated. So, as you can see, a Georgescu victory could prove to be quite a headache, both for the Ukraine and for NATO itself. And yet, this is what 23% of Romanians voted for. But the point is that Georgescu's views do not seem to square with the general sentiment of Romanians about NATO and Ukraine. But then, why the hell did they vote for him? How could he win in the first round? Is it so easy to manipulate millions of voters? Well, pay close attention.
Fed up.
It seems Romanians have had enough. For many, the country has become a circus in recent years, and many analysts are clear. Georgescu's first round victory is not because Romanians are particularly pro-Russian. No, his victory was due to something quite different: wariness. But what's there to be so tired of? Well, of course, here we're talking about the general economic situation of the country. I don't know how many of you know about this, but Romania is the poorest country in the Eurozone, and it will continue to be until Bulgaria joins the Eurozone. In fact, it's estimated that of the 19 million Romanian citizens, 32% are still at risk of poverty or social exclusion. It's true that in recent years, wages have been growing, and some families have been able to break out of the rut. In 2023, for example, monthly household income grew by just over 12%. But keep in mind, nominally. The reality is that inflation has eaten up all these increases. In fact, inflation still remains the highest in the Eurozone at 5.4%. Therefore, it's not surprising that more than 70% of Romanians consider this issue to be the most important one right now. What's more, can you guess who campaigned on inflation to the point of boredom? Georgescu himself. And in this case, there's nothing to reproach him for. A whopping 90% of Romanians say they have had to cut costs at home, either by reducing the purchase of appliances, clothes, or furniture. So it makes sense that this issue is being talked about, and that naturally, Romanians vote for less conventional alternatives as a wake-up call to the big parties. But if only it were just due to the economy. No, in Romania, Georgescu also won the first round for a reason: people's wariness with the political class. But why? Take a look at this.
Senior official in Romania's governing Liberals accused of bribery. Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu involved in the Nordis scandal.
Whether on the left or on the right, Romanians are constantly confronted with corruption cases. The latest, the Nordis case, a scandal where this real estate conglomerate sold the same apartments several times fraudulently. A scandal in which the former socialist prime minister, Ciolacu, has been involved. VisualPolitik community, Romanians have been having to put up with this corruption for years. In 2016, for example, Vasile Blaga, the conservative pro-market opposition leader at the time, resigned on corruption charges. In 2019, the president of the Social Democratic Party, Liviu Dragnea, was also sent to jail for corruption. The list is almost endless. It's not surprising, therefore, that Romanians wanted to punish the traditional parties by voting for Georgescu. Well, guess what? This brings us to an absolutely crucial idea. There may have been excessive Russian interference, but the case of Romania and the rise of the pro-Russian Georgescu also teach us a valuable lesson. Democracy and politics is not just about voting every few years in elections. If the system doesn't respond as it should and the problems are not corrected, what happens is what happens. Populism appears in its worst version. And then a candidate like Georgescu, whom many clearly consider an agent of an authoritarian and repressive regime like the Russian one, are capable of threatening the most basic notions of freedom that we have cultivated in the West. In the end, the elections have been called off, which has also generated a lot of debate and arguments for all tastes. On the one hand, Russia has attempted to pervert the Romanian elections by apparently violating the rules on candidate financing and distributing all sorts of misleading messages. This in itself appears to be a clear example of dishonest participation and unfair competition. However, on the other hand, Moscow is not being accused of buying votes or manipulating the count. In the end, it was the Romanians who voted for what they wanted. Be that as it may, the question now is, what do you think of this electoral suspension? Do you think there are strong arguments for it? How do you think Romanian society will react now? Leave us your opinions below in the comments and we'll start a debate. And very important, if you like this video, give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. These are small gestures that help us out a lot. As always, thank you so much for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.